It was a quiet night at the Franklin County Emergency Dispatch Center, Massachusetts. The clock read 2:37 a.m., and paramedic David Sullivan was finishing his coffee when the phone rang. He put on his headset, expecting another routine call. 911, what's your emergency? His firm, professional voice filled the line. For a moment there was silence. Then, a small, tearful voice whispered, "Mr. My little brother. He's not breathing." David felt a tightness in his chest. The voice belonged to a child, probably a boy. "What's your name, sweetheart? Where are you?" "I'm Oliver. I'm home with my little brother, Noah. He was sleeping, and now he's all limp, and I don't know what to do." The panic in the boy's voice was unmistakable. David immediately entered an emergency code to dispatch an ambulance to the location. "Stay with me, Oliver. The ambulance is on its way. Can you tell me if Noah looks blue or pale?" "He's all white, mister. And he's not making any noise." David's heart pounded. He had handled many difficult calls, but few involved children. And this one seemed particularly delicate. "All right, Oliver. We're gonna help Noah together, okay? Can you put the phone on speaker and go to him?" A sound of muffled sobs and hurried footsteps came through. "I'm here. He's in his little bed." "Great, sweetheart. Now listen carefully. I want you to put both hands on his chest and see if it moves up and down. Is he breathing at all?" A nerve-wracking pause. "No. It's not moving." David took a deep breath, holding back his emotions. "Then we need to help Noah breathe. Can you pick him up very carefully and lay him on the floor on his back?" He heard sniffles and shifting noises. Oliver was doing his best. "I'm scared, mister. I don't want him to go away." The boy's voice cracked. David felt tears welling up in his own eyes. "I know, Oliver, but I promise we're going to do everything we can to save Noah. Okay? Now, I need you to do something very important. Put 2 fingertips in the middle of his chest and press lightly, like you're giving his heart a hug. Do it fast, about 30 times, and tell me when you're done." David listened as the small fingers pressed against the baby's chest. The courage of this boy was extraordinary. "I'm doing it." "Great. Now I want you to blow gently into his mouth twice, like blowing out a birthday candle, but softer." David stayed alert, listening to every movement. Seconds later, Oliver shouted, "He moved. He moved, mister." David's eyes filled with tears. "That's it, champ. Keep going. The ambulance is almost there." And then he heard something he would never forget. "Mister, do you think God is listening to us? Because I asked him to save Noah." David couldn't hold back his tears. "Oliver, I think he heard you, and I think he sent you to be Noah's little angel today." Seconds later, the ambulance siren echoed through the phone. The ambulance raced through the dark city streets, the siren cutting through the still night. Inside, the paramedics closely monitored Noah, administering oxygen and checking his vital signs. The baby was weak but stable, which was already a huge relief. Oliver sat on the bench nearby, his small hands clenched together. His eyes were red from crying, but he tried to be strong. After all, he was the big brother. One of the paramedics, a woman named Emily, noticed his anxious expression and leaned toward him. "Are you okay, champ?" Oliver looked at her and nodded, but his voice was weak and shaky as he replied, "I'm scared. Is Noah really going to be okay?" Emily smiled kindly, trying to reassure him. "The doctors at the hospital will take great care of him, Oliver. But you already did the most important part. If you hadn't called and helped, he might not have made it. You saved your brother." Oliver bit his lip, lost in thought. His mind replayed that moment of sheer panic when he saw Noah so still, not breathing. His heart was still racing from the memory. A lump formed in his throat. I just didn't want him to go away," he whispered softly. Emily sighed and reached for his hand. "I know, sweetheart, and you did everything right. You were so brave." Oliver felt tears fill his eyes again, but he held them back. He didn't want to cry in front of adults, especially strangers, but deep down all he wanted was to see his mom and make sure Noah was really okay. At the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, Noah was immediately taken to the pediatric ward for evaluation. Oliver tried to follow, but a nurse gently stopped him. "We need to take care of your little brother now, sweetheart. But I promise you'll see him soon. Okay?" Oliver nodded, though his chest tightened. He was taken to a small waiting room, where they gave him a blanket and a stuffed bear. But he didn't want a stuffed bear. He wanted Noah. Minutes passed, then half an hour, then almost an hour. Oliver didn't know what to do with himself. He felt small and powerless. He had done everything he could. But what if it wasn't enough? That was when a gentle voice spoke behind him. "Oliver." The boy looked up and saw a man in uniform, with slightly graying brown hair and kind eyes. He immediately recognized the voice. "You're the man from the phone." David smiled and knelt beside him. "Yes, I am. And you're the bravest little hero I've ever met." Oliver lowered his gaze, nervously playing with the stuffed bear's paws. "I just did what you told me to do. And that saved Noah's life, Oliver. You did something most kids your age wouldn't be able to do. You stayed calm, followed instructions, and helped your brother when he needed it most. That's incredible." The boy stared at him for a moment, absorbing those words. He wanted to believe he had really been strong, but the truth was he had been terrified. I thought he was going to die," he confessed, his voice breaking. David placed a hand on his shoulder. "And yet you didn't give up. You kept trying. That's what makes a real hero, Oliver." The boy sniffled, and David pulled a tissue from his pocket, handing it to him. "It's okay to cry, you know? Even heroes cry." Oliver wiped his eyes quickly, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Have you ever cried?" David chuckled. "More times than I can count. Especially today." They exchanged a quiet understanding. Oliver felt a little more comfortable around this kind man who genuinely seemed to care. Just then, the waiting room door burst open. "Oliver!" The boy turned and, before he could react, was pulled into a tight, warm embrace. His mother was there, kneeling, holding him as if she would never let go. "Mommy!" She kissed the top of his head, tears streaming down her face. "Sweetheart, I came as soon as I heard. My God, I'm so sorry I wasn't home. Are you okay? Is Noah okay?" Oliver clung to her, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume. "I tried, Mommy. I tried to help him." She pulled back just enough to cup his face in her hands. "You were incredible, my love. You saved your brother. I am so proud of you." His tears returned, but this time, he didn't hold them back. "I was so scared. I know, sweetheart. But everything is okay now." At that moment, a doctor entered with a gentle smile. "Good evening, ma'am. I have good news. Noah is stable and out of danger." After the doctor delivered the good news, Oliver finally took a deep breath. Even though Noah was out of danger, he didn't want to leave the hospital until he was absolutely sure his little brother was okay. David noticed his hesitation and knelt beside him again. "Would you like to see Noah?" Oliver's eyes lit up with hope. "Can I?" David glanced at Oliver's mother, who smiled and nodded. He spoke with the medical staff, and a few minutes later, he led Oliver to the pediatric ward. As they entered the hospital room, Oliver saw Noah lying in a small hospital crib, still connected to a tiny oxygen tube. He looked so small, so fragile. But his chest was rising and falling slowly, and that was enough for Oliver to feel a wave of relief. He carefully approached and gently took his brother's tiny hand. "Hi, Noah," he whispered. "I told you you'd be okay." The baby couldn't respond, but his little fingers twitched slightly, as if he could feel his brother's presence. Oliver smiled, his eyes filled with emotion. David, watching from the side, felt a lump in his throat. He knelt beside Oliver. "You know, he's really lucky to have you as a brother." Oliver shrugged, still focused on Noah. "But I was scared, really scared. What if I hadn't been able to do it?" David sighed. "That's part of being brave. Feeling scared but doing what needs to be done anyway. What you did today was incredible, Oliver. You saved Noah's life because you didn't give up." Oliver looked at him and slowly nodded, as if finally believing it himself. Just then, the doctor entered the room. "Mrs. Miller?" he called Oliver's mother. She turned to him quickly. Yes? Is something wrong? The doctor shook his head. Nothing wrong, but I need to talk to you privately about what happened to Noah. Can we step outside for a moment? Oliver's mother hesitated, looking at her sons. But David reassured her with a nod. I'll stay here with them. Go ahead. She nodded and followed the doctor out of the room. Oliver frowned. What do you think happened to Noah, mister? David glanced at the baby and the medical equipment around him. I think the doctor wants to figure out why he stopped breathing. Sometimes, tiny babies can have trouble like that. But now the doctors will take good care of him. The boy sighed, still holding his brother's tiny hand. I wish he would never get sick again. David smiled and ruffled Oliver's hair. That just shows how much you love him. But you did everything you could today, Oliver. Now it's the doctor's job to make sure he stays healthy. Minutes later, Oliver's mother returned, looking more worried than before. Mom? What did the doctor say? Oliver asked. She took a deep breath before answering. He said Noah had an apnea episode. That means, for some reason, he stopped breathing for a while. They don't know the exact cause yet, but they want to keep him under observation for a few more hours. Oliver's eyes widened. But he's going to be okay, right? She smiled, stroking her son's cheek. Yes, sweetheart. They don't think it's anything serious. But we have to be extra careful. The boy slowly nodded, processing the information. David looked at Mrs. Miller and noticed the exhaustion on her face. She worked night shifts, took care of the children alone during the day. She must have been beyond exhausted. Mrs. Miller, Oliver told me he was home alone with Noah when this happened. Wasn't there any adult at home? She lowered her head, ashamed. I worked the night shift. I didn't have anyone to stay with them tonight, and since Noah usually sleeps through the night, I thought it would be okay. David exchanged a concerned look with her. Have you thought about getting help? Maybe a babysitting service or a family member who can stay with them at night? She sighed. I wish I could, but I can't afford a babysitter right now. And my family lives in another state. David understood. He had helped many single mothers working hard to support their children, often at the expense of their own well-being. I know it's not easy, but Oliver is still a child. And tonight, even though he was incredible, he went through something really scary. She looked at her son, who was gently caressing Noah's tiny head. I know, I just wanted to give them the best. But maybe I do need help. David nodded. And there's no shame in that. Oliver, listening to everything, looked at his mother. Mom, I can take care of Noah whenever you need. But I don't want to be alone anymore. She felt a tightness in her chest at his words. Oh, sweetheart, I promise I'll never leave you alone like that again. David saw a moment of understanding pass between mother and son. Something had changed. A stronger bond had formed. Noah would grow up knowing he had a big brother who would always protect him. And Oliver had learned that he didn't have to carry all the weight alone. Sometimes even little heroes need help. The first light of morning began to peek over the horizon when Noah was finally discharged. The doctors assured that he was fine but recommended that Mrs. Miller take him to a specialist for further evaluation in the coming months. Oliver clutched Noah's car seat tightly with both hands as they walked out of the hospital. He didn't want to let go of his little brother for even a second. David accompanied them to the exit, feeling a mix of relief and affection for the family. Throughout his career, he had witnessed countless emergencies, but something about this night had deeply marked him. When they reached the parking lot, Oliver's mother turned to David, her expression filled with gratitude. I don't even know how to thank you. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened. David shook his head. The real hero is right here. He glanced at Oliver and winked. The boy smiled shyly and gripped the car seat's handle even tighter. I just did what you told me to do. David knelt to meet the boy's gaze. And you did much more than that, Oliver. You didn't just save your brother. You taught all of us a lesson about courage. Oliver blinked, surprised. I taught you something? David chuckled. Yes, you reminded me why I chose this job. Sometimes, in the daily grind, we forget that every call we receive can change lives. But tonight, I saw the true meaning of my work. Tears welled in Mrs. Miller's eyes. She looked at the paramedic, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "David, can I ask you a favor?" "Of course. Anything." She took a deep breath. "Would you visit us from time to time? I think Oliver has grown really attached to you. And, to be honest, I'd also feel safer having someone like you around." David was taken aback by the request, but deep down he felt a warmth in his chest. He had helped so many families over the years, but few had formed such a strong connection with him. He looked at Oliver, who was staring at him with hopeful eyes. "What do you think, champ? Would you like me to come by every now and then?" The boy nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, we can watch superhero movies, and I can teach you how to play video games." David laughed. "Deal. But only if you promise to teach me properly, because I'm terrible at video games." Mrs. Miller smiled. "I think you just made a new best friend." They exchanged contact information and said their goodbyes with warm hugs. As David watched the family drive away, he stood still for a moment, reflecting. That night had been more than just another shift. It had been a powerful reminder of the impact small actions can have on people's lives. And, in a way, he felt that it wasn't just Noah who had been saved that night. Oliver saved Noah, and, unknowingly, he saved David from losing himself in the cold routine of his job. Maybe that was the true meaning of being a hero. In the days following Noah's emergency, the Miller family's routine changed completely. Mrs. Miller requested a shift change at work to be more present at night. Fortunately, her boss understood the situation and allowed her to work part-time during the day instead. Even so, she knew she would still need support. And that's when Oliver had an idea. "Mom, why can't David be our real friend? Like, part of our family?" His mother chuckled and ruffled his hair. "Well, sweetheart, he is already our friend. He's visited twice this week. Remember? Since that night at the hospital, David had kept in touch with the family. He called to check on Noah and even spent an afternoon playing video games with Oliver." "Yeah, but I want him to be around more. He always saves people, right? I think he could be like our superhero." His mother smiled but grew thoughtful. Deep down, she also felt that David had become a part of this new chapter in their lives. A few days later, David was invited to dinner at the Miller home. He arrived promptly at 7 p.m., bringing a small gift for Oliver. A metal keychain with a superhero symbol. "Now you have your own hero emblem. After all, you saved a life." Oliver took the keychain, his eyes shining. "Wow, now I'm really a superhero." David laughed and tousled the boy's hair. Dinner was filled with laughter and conversations about David's childhood, his job as a paramedic, and, of course, the night of Noah's rescue. Oliver couldn't stop retelling the story, but now he spoke about it with pride instead of fear. "And then, I blew into his mouth and he started moving. I thought it was a miracle." David smiled but grew serious. "Maybe it was. But the real miracle was your bravery. You didn't freeze, you did what needed to be done. That's something very special." Oliver's mother looked at David with gratitude. "And you helped him stay calm. He wouldn't have been able to do it without you." David smiled, but something about those words struck him deeply. The truth was, he had handled hundreds of emergency calls. He had helped save many lives. But, for some reason, this story had stayed with him in a different way. Maybe because, this time, it wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something bigger. After dinner, while Oliver played in the living room with Noah, Mrs. Miller found David in the kitchen washing dishes. "You don't have to do that, you know?" She laughed. "I know, but I like helping." She observed him for a moment, then spoke in a more serious tone. "David, Oliver talks about you all the time. I think, deep down, he sees you as a father figure." David froze for a moment. "Really?" She nodded. "He never had a father around. His dad left us when I was still pregnant with Noah. Since then, I've done everything on my own." David looked down, absorbing her words. "That must have been hard." She sighed. "It was. But I had to be strong for my kids. And after that night, I realized that maybe I don't have to be strong alone." David felt his heart race. He had spent his life dedicating himself to his job, saving lives, but he had never stopped to consider having something more meaningful, something like a family. He looked at Oliver playing with Noah and smiled as he watched them. I never imagined I'd become so close to you all, but somehow I feel at home here. Mrs. Miller gave him a soft smile. And we love having you around. Just then, David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It was work. He answered, and his supervisor's urgent voice filled the line. David, we need you immediately. There's a fire in an apartment building downtown. There are children trapped on the 3rd floor. David's heartbeat quickened. I'm on my way. He hung up and turned to Mrs. Miller. I have to go. She nodded, understanding. Oliver ran up to him. What's wrong, David? David knelt down and held the boy's shoulders. Some people need help. I have to go save some more lives. Oliver stared at him, wide-eyed. Then you really are a superhero. David laughed and ruffled the boy's hair. And so are you, Oliver. Never forget that. He gave a quick goodbye and rushed out the door. As he sped through the city streets, sirens blaring, David realized something. This family had become important to him. And maybe, when this emergency was over, he wouldn't just be coming back as a paramedic, but as a part of their lives. The ambulance raced through the streets, sirens wailing. As David gripped the steering wheel tightly, the radio crackled with updates. An apartment fire in a downtown building, flames spreading fast. 3 children were trapped on the 3rd floor. David's heart pounded. Every second mattered. When they arrived at the scene, the building was already engulfed in smoke and fire. Firefighters were battling the flames while a desperate mother sobbed near the barricades. David ran toward the incident commander. Where are the kids? The man pointed to a window on the 3rd floor, where faint shadows could be seen moving. They're in there. The fire blocked the main staircase, and the smoke is getting worse. We have to get them out fast. Without hesitation, David grabbed his equipment and followed a firefighter up the emergency stairwell. The heat was intense, and thick smoke made it hard to see. He covered his mouth with a damp cloth and pushed forward, guided by the distant cries of children. When they reached the apartment, the door was jammed. The firefighter used an axe to break through, revealing a terrifying scene. 3 children huddled together in a corner, the oldest boy trying to shield his younger siblings. David rushed forward. We're getting you out of here. Who's the youngest? The older boy, around 10 years old, pointed to his unconscious little sister. She won't wake up. David scooped the girl into his arms, feeling her fragile body against his chest. He checked her pulse, weak but present. We need to move now, he shouted. The building groaned, the fire consuming the structure. They had no time. With the firefighter carrying the other 2 children, they ran back toward the stairwell. Flames licked the walls, and smoke thickened around them. David held the little girl close, shielding her face. Just as they reached the exit, part of the ceiling collapsed behind them, sending a shower of sparks. They barely made it out. Outside, paramedics rushed to treat the children. David carefully laid the unconscious girl on a stretcher, monitoring her breathing as an oxygen mask was placed over her face. Moments later, her tiny fingers twitched. She was waking up. A wave of relief washed over him. As he stepped back, he saw the mother of the children running toward them, collapsing into a tearful embrace with her kids. David exhaled, his body finally registering the exhaustion. But more than that, he felt something deeper, gratitude. Tonight, he had saved more lives. But as he turned away from the fire, his thoughts drifted to Oliver and Noah. And that's when he knew he needed to go back to them. The next morning, David showed up at the Miller home. There was something different in his demeanor. He looked lighter, yet more determined. Mrs. Miller opened the door, surprise flickering across her face. David, I heard about the fire. Are you okay? He nodded. Yeah, we saved the kids. Oliver came running from the living room. David, Mom told me you were saving people from a burning building. Were you really inside the fire? David crouched down, meeting the boy's excited gaze. I was, but you know what? The whole time, I kept thinking about you and Noah. Oliver tilted his head. Us. David took a deep breath. Yes, I realized something important last night. Some people come into our lives unexpectedly and change everything. And I don't want to just be a visitor in your life. I want to be here. Really be here." Mrs. Miller's eyes widened slightly. "David, are you saying?" He smiled gently. "I want to be a part of this family." Before anyone could react, Oliver's face lit up, and he threw himself into David's arms. "I knew it. I knew you were our hero." David laughed, hugging the boy tightly. Mrs. Miller, tears glistening in her eyes, smiled as she looked at them. "I think you've been part of our family for a while now." At that moment, Noah stirred in his crib, letting out a tiny yawn. David glanced over and felt warmth flood his chest. He had spent years saving strangers, always moving from one emergency to another. But now, for the first time, he had found something that felt permanent. A place where he belonged. Time passed, and what once seemed unlikely had become a new reality. David was no longer just a friend of the family, he was family. He helped Oliver with his homework, took Noah to doctor's appointments, and provided support to Mrs. Miller whenever she needed it. Oliver, who used to wake up at night terrified that something would happen to Noah, now slept soundly, knowing he wasn't alone. One night, after putting Oliver to bed and checking on Noah, David stepped onto the porch, finding Mrs. Miller gazing at the stars. "You never get tired of this view, do you?" he teased. She chuckled. "I guess I never really stopped to look before. I was always rushing, always worrying about the next day. But now I feel like I can breathe." David stood beside her, letting her words sink in. "And me? How do I make you feel?" he asked. She turned to him, surprised by the question. "Do you want the honest answer?" He nodded. She took a deep breath. "You make me feel safe. For the first time in years, I know I'm not alone." David felt something shift inside him. It was exactly how he felt, too. They stood there, side by side, watching the night sky, no words needed. The next morning, Oliver ran into the kitchen, his face beaming with excitement. "Today is a special day." David, flipping pancakes, raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What's so special about today?" "It's exactly 6 months since you saved Noah." David blinked in surprise. "You've been keeping track?" "Of course. And I thought we should celebrate." Mrs. Miller, overhearing, laughed. "And how do you want to celebrate, sweetheart?" Oliver shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe we could have a picnic at the park." David glanced at Mrs. Miller and grinned. "I think that's a great idea." Later that day, they gathered at the city park with a picnic basket full of food. Noah, now almost a year old, crawled on the grass, giggling. Oliver ran through the fallen leaves, chasing them as they floated in the breeze. At one point, he ran up to David, holding out a folded piece of paper. "I made something for you." David took it and unfolded it. It was a drawing, childish but full of meaning. In the center, there was a man in a uniform holding a baby, while a boy stood smiling beside them. Above them, written in uneven letters, were the words, "My hero." David felt his throat tighten. "You made this for me?" Oliver nodded eagerly. "Yes, you saved Noah and helped me not be scared anymore. That means you're my hero." David took a deep breath, emotion swelling in his chest. "Oliver, I'm the luckiest man in the world to have met you and your family." Oliver grinned and threw his arms around David in a hug. Mrs. Miller watched, her heart full. David looked at her over Oliver's head, and without words, they both understood. Something special had been born from that one fateful night. A desperate call had not only saved a life but had created a new family. And what had begun in fear and uncertainty had grown into something beautiful. A home, a future, a love that would last forever.